Oh,
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's fine, eh? Oh, you can hear it. All right. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. We end the session on financing. The title of the session is Financing Shaping the Future of Higher Education. This, of course, is a very important topic. All the universities that many of us come from, in one way or the other, have to deal with financing issues. We have 3 presentations this afternoon. Roberto Escalante Semerena, who doesn't need much introduction. He was in the previous session. He's the secretary of the Association of Universities of Latin America and the Caribbean, UDWAL, and also he's an IAU deputy board member. He's a Mexican economist who, after graduating with a bachelor in economics from the Faculty of Economics of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, obtained a master's and a PhD in rural development from the University of London in the United Kingdom. He has served as the Dean of the Faculty of Economics at the National University of Mexico, where he is currently a professor of natural resources economics. He's also a former editor of the journal Investigación Económica and editor of the journal Natural Económica. So welcome to our speaker. The next speaker is going to be Antoni Canel, General Manager, Universidad Oberta de Catalunya in Spain. He has a bachelor degree in physical sciences from the University of Barcelona, an MBA from ESADE, and a GMP from IESE. He held the position of Vice President of Systems Integration at T-Systems until July 2014. Professor Kane held a number of executive positions in the field of higher education and management, first as Director of Business Development at GECA, and later as General Manager of Planeta UOC SLA and Assistant General Manager of the UOC from 2001 to 2005. And since 2014, he has served as General Manager of the UOC and Managing Director of the UOC Foundation. The third speaker will be myself, and I'll introduce myself just before I start speaking. I'm doubling up as a chair as well as a speaker. The panel it suffers from gender bias. This is not the intention. There were several people who were supposed to be on this panel. Unfortunately, they cancelled, and that's why I was roped in to be both chair and presenter. The other people who were not able to join us are very distinguished women academics and administrators, but I'm sure we'll have a very good conversation after the presentation. So first of all, I'd like to ask Roberto to make his presentation. I'll give them about 10 minutes. By the time we get close to 10 minutes, I'll wave at you so that we have enough time for discussion. Thank you.
So I know that you can hear me. I mean that the microphone doesn't go through the loudspeakers, and it goes, I mean, only through these machines. Well, I don't have a presentation. As a matter of fact, I come as a replacement of somebody who, at the end, I mean, couldn't be in the breakout session about financing, and during my participation in the board of IAU, I have been insisting on several occasions about the problems that financing higher education is. How is it impacting, higher education nowadays in the region, in my region at least, in Latin America and the Caribbean. Well, the title of the session is Financing Shaping the Future of Higher Education. I should say that to talk about that, we have to perhaps talk a little bit about what has been happening, with financing in the world, and in the case of Latin America in particular, as far as financing higher education is concerned. Well, I could argue that in the last 30 years, we have seen a very important change in terms of financing higher education in the world and in the region. We all know, for instance, that from that time to now, we have acknowledged the creation of many institutions, private education, higher education institutions, vis-a-vis what has been happening, to the creation of new public universities. During the 70s and 60s and 70s, states, governments invested a lot in public universities. They grew a lot, at least in Latin America. We saw the emergence of many important new universities in the region. However, from the 70s onwards, the scenario changed quite dramatically. Public spending or public financing for higher education was cut quite dramatically, but at the same time, the demand, for higher education grew exponentially. So, the net result of that was that those students wanted to go to university or to higher education institutions were looked after by private universities or private higher education institutions. That was really the net result. So that is until now, I could argue that is still happening. In Latin America, except during the government of the Cristina Fernández de Kirchner in Argentina, there was a little bit of a change. For that. But in the rest of the region, governments are not investing, are not spending money in higher education. They have left that task, that job, to the private institutions. Chile is the most pristine example of that. 99% of the offer for higher education in Chile is provided by private institutions. So that's something that we have to acknowledge. I think to start the discussion, we have to recognize that that is an important fact to take into account. But that has consequences. Most of the private institutions operating in the region are teaching institutions, do not do research. By and large, perhaps, we can find, for instance, the Jesuit universities which are private. They do research. But compared to the capacity of, as far as research is concerned, that public universities have, private universities, they don't do research. Are basically teaching institutions. And in some cases, one could say, that's good enough. Not necessarily. They have to do research. But I think there are many universities, private universities, that can be questioned I think, in terms of what is the quality of the kind of education that they are providing. In Ecuador, for instance, during the government of Mr. Correa, Rafael Correa, the quality assurance institution in charge of supervising universities in that country, they closed down 14 universities that they considered they were not. They could not call themselves universities. And something similar is happening in Peru at the moment. So that's something that I wanted to say to start with. We have a scenario in which, I mean, public universities are suffering important cuts, I mean, in terms of our financing, and then we have, as I said, basically teaching private high education universities operating where the quality can be questioned. So that's one of the things that I think we should take into account. A second fact that I think that should also be considered is that, and that is the case of Brazil, that investment has also incorporated the technological factor. And then here we have an extremely important, good representative of that, the Oberta University of Catalonia, which is a very important university, an online, full online university, and it's a Spanish university. Well, I don't know whether it's Spanish or Catalonian, but both. Because that's something to be discussed nowadays, as you all know. But it's a very important university located in Barcelona. And it's operating in Latin America. And is fostering very much online thing, and they are offering BAs and postgraduate masters and PhD as well, yes. As far as I, and that is happening, So investment in higher education is going not only through face-to-face universities, but very much, I mean, through incorporating technology and online type of universities. In Brazil, they are growing at a very extremely fast rate, 16%. I mean, of the whole population attended by high education institutions are online students. And it's expected that in 20 years, that might grow up to 40% or something of the sort. So that's something that we have to consider. I mean, financing goes through those channels. And I think that will continue. I mean, with artificial intelligence, that also Berta is working very much on those issues, on those topics, and blockchain and so on. I mean, it's going to shape, or is shaping already, or has shaped already. I mean, very much the scenario of higher education, at least in Latin America. So. The thing is that, I mean, we will have to think that the main question perhaps is, okay, I mean, financing can go up and down, can be public or private. I mean, that's a heterogeneous scenario. The thing is, what are the kind of institutions, higher education institutions we have, I mean, as a result of those financing policies? Well, there is a huge discussion about that. No? There is a huge discussion about that. My experience, I could say, as a Secretary General of the Universities of Latin American and the Caribbean universities, is that universities are not doing the job. Particularly, they are not doing well their job, particularly in the relationship with social needs. You know, I mean, and that's something, I mean, the Chileans are very, in my view, are a very sad example. Are a very sad example. Everything which is embedded in the higher education institutions in Chile is that you are an entrepreneur. If you are not an entrepreneur, you are useless, basically, you know? And that, to me, that's a very serious consequence of what is happening. 10 minutes. So 1 minute to finish? I mean, just to... I think that's the kind of questions that we have to answer. I mean, what are we doing? What kind of institutions we are creating with the type of financing policies that we have put in place, at least in the case of Latin America. And perhaps, I mean, I have heard things about Africa, and I think the scenario is not very different from what is happening in Latin America. Well, I leave it there, and I will be happy to respond some answers to some questions that I hope they are easy. If they are difficult, don't put them, please. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Let me start thanking IAU for inviting us to this session. And also let me start saying that I'm not academician, so I will talk about a management perspective of the university. My professional background is related with professional management, so this view is more from this point of view than from the academic point of view. If we can see our representation, please. So the idea of my keynote is trying to explain that high quality online universities are an opportunity for higher education systems. So as Roberto said before, online education, online university can be seen as a threat for the university, face-to-face university systems. In my opinion, we have to see this otherwise. Online education could be an opportunity for face-to-face systems also, and this is why I try to explain in my speech today. So, three main ideas. The first one is that growing demand of higher education versus limited public funding. This was already said by Roberto. We have seen this morning from Makerere University. They are talking about the growth of enrollment. Also, Anuyes, president, taught us about the growing of enrollment. So there is a huge demand that is increasing year by year, and this demand has to be fulfilled in some way. The other idea I want to share with you is that online education as a scalable and high efficient opportunity. I will show to you that online education is really efficient, is really scalable. They have a scalability, and I think it could be a way to enhance and to approach higher education to people. And finally, I will talk about UOC of our case as an example of quality and complementary online education. The word complementary, I think it's important. We think we can be complementary to the higher education system, to the face-to-face system, of course, and this is what we're trying to do in Iberoamerica, but also in other countries. So let's start with some figures. Here you have the increase of gross tertiary enrollment ratio in the last years, 20 years more or less, or more than less, and we can see that really the world the demand is growing very fast because population is growing, of course, but at the end the demand will increase in the next year. So we have to face this problem, and we have to see how to fulfill this demand in the more proper way. And this is one of the challenges I think the higher education has at this moment on the planet. But this is the reality. But on the other side, if we look at the funds, what we see, here you have figures about the GDP the percentage of GDP that countries are dedicating to higher education, and we see, in the case of Spain, we are talking about a 1.2% of GDP dedicated to higher education. The average of OECD is 1.5. So these are very low figures, we can say so. I have to admit this, but I have a bad news regarding this. The bad news is that I don't have the perception that this will grow in the future. Why? Because countries are facing now big challenges regarding maintaining the welfare society. We have an accelerating aging population. We have an increase of pensions, so we have to maintain the pension system. We have to maintain the healthy systems on the countries. And we, as a university, as a public university, that we are discussing with governments, we have to struggle to maintain the level of funding, of public funding. We are struggling with this, but the answer of the government is saying, don't expect increase of funding. You have to survive with the actual funding. This is the reality, and I think this will be the reality in the future. So this means that we need to find other ways to make higher education more efficient. And think online could be an answer, one of the answers, not the total answer, but could be one of the answers. Some more figures. The demand of education is increasing, I have already said, but OECD estimated that in 2009 that in 2030 it will be represented of more than 400 million people will ask for higher education in the future. This means to fulfill this demand, we will need 2 universities of 20,000 studies each day to cover this demand. What does it mean? This is really impossible in terms of the actual model. If we want to fulfill this increasing demand with the traditional model, with financing infrastructure, facilities, and with the actual model, we have to admit that this will be not possible, and we have to find another way to do this. Well, let's see how online higher education is really a scalable system, and I have to say, taking into account my experience in the UC, that it's really an efficient solution. Let me start with some figures about the university. The Open University started his operations in 1995. It has born in internet, we can say so. World Wide Web was created in 1994. Open University was the first online university, we can say so, because we started working in 1995, and we decided to do this using internet as the instrument to make distant education happen. We can say so. Nowadays, we have 77,000 graduates, more than 73,000 students. Well, here you have the figures. In any case, what I want to say is that we have grown very, very fast in these 25 years, and the demand is clearly increasing. To see this and to show what does cost the financing of one student in the normal universities of the OECD, we're talking about $15,000 per student every year as an average. And this is the average cost in OECD of a student. In our case, the cost is more or less a third. It's more or less a third. And I will try to explain how this is possible. And I think it's a way to help other universities to make this efficiency happen. Here you have the growth of the university in the last years. As you can see, we have grown more than 10% every year, and the funding of the public government has stayed constant. So we are talking about more or less 20% of funding in our university, and we are increasing, maintaining the public funding. How is this possible? The answer is because we are scalable. We can do this because the university can refinance his activity via the activity of our students. So scalability is a topic, and to try to explain this scalability, let me talk about this clover leaf model. Our model of costs are explained via 3 vectors. No, we have 1/3 of our costs are related with faculty and administrative staff. The other 1/3 is related with suppliers, and the other 1/3 is related with external talent. We are talking about teaching staff, not full-time teaching staff. They are working through other universities, other organizations. And I think this is a key topic, a key explanation of our scalability model. Regarding suppliers, we can have our main investment is technology. So we are not investing in facilities, we are investing in technology, in teaching resources, and so on. So this is a flexible and a scalable model. That means that we are managing our programs using and involving external teaching professors coming from other organizations, from other universities. They are sharing their knowledge in order to perform our activities. Yes, I will go through a little bit. But what is the topic? And let me put this slide here. So if you have an increasing demand and we cannot deliver this demand with the classical public universities, the risk is that a lot of other private initiative will come and will try to cover this demand with private initiatives. And this is really a risk, and for me and for us as a public university with a special legal statement, we are public, but with as a foundation, as a private foundation, but nevertheless public, we said that there is a line, a red line that has not to be crossed. This line is the quality line. So we have to assure to perform with high quality online studies. And this is the statement of our university. And we have to avoid to harm quality in such kind of online universities. To finalize, so this is our model. In any case, what we are saying is we have a study in the center. The student is in the center. We are a studying center, centric university. We give to the student tools and resources, teaching support, and networking community. This is the role. We are not broadcasting classrooms. We are not talking heads. We are making a really continuous student support in order to assure a continuous and formative assessment. This is the model that we have, and this role of the external professor allows us to share knowledge from other institutions, from other universities. And let me finally explain what we are doing regarding this with other universities in Iberoamerica, but also worldwide. What we are facing now is that our experience in Spain, our experience as online university in Spain, we think can be shared, and we think it's a way to help other university systems, other countries, to establish a way to assure quality assurance in online. And not what we're not nowadays doing with other countries like Mexico, Chile, Ecuador, is working with the quality agencies in order to explain our experience, to share our experience, and to help these countries to assure the prestige of online as a methodology that can work besides the face-to-face methodology. And this is what we are doing now. And let me say also as an example that this flexible model, this model that allows external professors to share with us the training of our students, allows us to work with other institutions like UNITAR, as a clear example in our degree of conflictology. This is an example of how to share knowledge and how to act as a network, as a hub that can join different knowledge coming from other organizations in a program, online program. So, conclusions. The creation of public and complementary online universities may be a solution to the growing need for higher education in the countries around the world. So we think we are part of the solution, and we want to help the university system of our countries to make this happen. Higher education laws must allow for and recognize online higher education. So we need to establish a clear regulation to assure quality of online education. This is a must. And quality agencies need to ensure the quality of online universities. And this is the way to avoid the introduction of, we can say, these bad proposals coming from the private side. And I have to admit, there are a lot of money coming from funds, from investment funds, that are now putting a lot of money in this kind of players trying to take advantage of this high demand coming now. No? And at the end, as a final statement, universities of the future cannot act alone and with their own staff only, but need to be embedded in global networks and act as an open knowledge hub. And online education offers this opportunity. Online helps to work different people together. Technology is a way to put together people coming from different organizations. Knowledge is no more a monopoly of universities. Knowledge is everywhere. Knowledge is in organizations, in companies, in hospitals, in museums. So we have a clear tool, which is technology, to put all this knowledge together and to perform programs together with other universities to face the increased demand of new students, and also to take a solution that allows interdisciplinary solutions, to put together different disciplines in the same table and work together to perform new programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let me wear my hat as a presenter. My name is Paul Tiambezeleza. I'm the Vice Chancellor of the United States International University, Africa, based in Nairobi. I started that position 4 years ago. Before that, I spent 25 years in Canada and the United States, both as an academic but also as an administrator. What I'm going to share with you is the ways in which these issues that we have already heard something about reflect themselves in certain parts of Africa, if not the continent as a whole. And as Roberto said, a lot of the experiences of Latin America are echoed on the African continent. I will talk about 4 things. First of all, just very briefly, revenue sources for universities. And secondly, the growing phenomenon of privatization of universities that Roberto made reference to. And then thirdly, the ways in which some universities on the continent, and I'm sure elsewhere, are trying to deal with that challenge, namely by promoting advancement or fundraising. And then finally, I'll try to look at another growing phenomenon, namely public-private partnerships in the funding of universities, particularly infrastructure and other areas. As we all know, revenue sources for universities are multiple. Some have become more important than others as changes have taken place. State subsidies which used to be the main source in many countries on the continent, is declining. And this is a story you find elsewhere. Student tuition and fees are rising, and this is expressed in emergence of what some people call cost-sharing arrangements. And then thirdly, you find that many institutions are embarking on marketing of institutional facilities and services, including consultancies, in order to generate extra income. And then, of course, the whole issue of donations, philanthropy, is becoming more important for many institutions. And then, of course, some institutions increasingly go on the market to borrow money, for investing in certain infrastructures, and that is also tied to the growth of public-private partnerships that are increasing. The second thing I just wanted to say very briefly is the privatization of universities. And this is manifesting itself in a number of ways. One, of course, through the explosion of private institutions, which Roberto again made reference to. This is evident in Africa. Today in Africa, there are more private universities in number than public ones, although enrollments are still higher for public institutions than for private ones. But this trend is likely to change quite rapidly in the next decade or so. There is also the growing privatization of public institutions. So institutions that are public in name are increasingly dependent on private sources of funds. So they are less public in financing and public in terms of legal standing, which of course has implications. And then there is also the proliferation of for-profit institutions on the continent and of course elsewhere. The decline in public funding for higher education institutions, the data is readily available. We saw some of it in terms of the OECD, and Roberto talked about Latin America. UNESCO data shows that between 2000 and 2013, government expenditure on education as a percentage of GDP fell in 39 countries. 12 of those were in Africa. Expenditure on tertiary education as a percentage of total government expenditure fell in 34 countries, of which 11 were in Africa. And then expenditure on tertiary education as a percentage of government expenditure on education fell in 33 countries, 12 of them were in Africa. Government expenditure per tertiary student fell in 37 countries, 16 of them were in Africa. Now, how did higher education institutions respond to declining public support? The responses have been varied, obviously. One has been cost containment through, enlarging class sizes and teaching loads, which lead to issues of quality that we heard just a moment ago. Deferring maintenance, substituting lower cost part-time faculty for higher cost full-time faculty, dropping low priority programs, and cutting or freezing financial assistance. African politicians, for example, are notorious for dismissing the humanities and social sciences as useless and extolling STEM. Now, there is nothing wrong with STEM. Of course, there is also nothing wrong with the humanities and social sciences. In fact, you need to focus on both. The other response, apart from cost containment, has been the creation of new delivery systems. What we just heard now, online education, collaboration, and international networks as a means of providing additional resources that local institutions may not have. Tanzania, for example, now has a fairly robust online educational system. Kenya is planning to introduce. South Africa has always had one through UNISA. My colleague, the Vice Chancellor of UNISA, is over there. They have, I think you have what? Over 300,000 students. 300,000 students. Yeah, so online education is becoming an increasingly important platform. The third response has been, of course, to try to raise alternative revenue streams. This includes, raising more fees, and increasing tuition itself, which of course has provoked challenges from students. In South Africa, you hear of the fees must fall movement, but this is by no means confined to South Africa. Protests against tuition increases can be found in other parts of the world, including Canada, the United States, various parts of Africa, and of course Britain. You remember when the government was trying to increase tuition to £9,000. There were all these massive demonstrations by students across England and the other parts of the United Kingdom. And then, of course, encouraging faculty to engage in entrepreneurial activities, including marketing of institutional facilities and encouraging consultancy services and establishing businesses on campuses or that are owned by the universities, some of which have very little relationship to what is the core business of universities. I know in Kenya, for example, some universities have established mortuaries, butcheries, and hotels, and so on and so forth, as a way of adding to shopping malls and so on, as a way of diversifying their revenue streams. And then, of course, promotion of philanthropy. I'll talk about that in a minute. The rise of cost sharing has taken various forms. One is introduction or imposition of sharp increases in tuition fees, establishment in some countries of dual track tuition fees for different groups of students, imposition of user charges for services that were previously free, reduction in the value of student loans, grants, and other stipends, and of course the diminution in the size of the public sector and official encouragement of the expansion of the private sector, private higher education sector. And of course there are a lot of debates about cost sharing, certainly in Africa. To its proponents, cost sharing is justified in terms of social equity, efficiency, and the needs of the universities. Its critics charge that it disadvantages the poor and undermines access and equity. In reality, the debate is really is less about the desirability of cost sharing and more about its appropriate levels. The challenges of financing higher education, of course, are not confined to developing countries. In the United States, as we all know, the issue is a hot button political issue right now in the Democratic primaries, and the level of student debt last year reached $1.6 trillion, which is higher than credit card debt. So this is not a problem just of poor countries. This is in fact a problem even in the rich countries, including the OECD, as we heard. Now, a lot of universities, therefore, are trying to embark on advancement, promoting advancement or fundraising or development. And of course, advancement requires, developing capacities. And some of the essential capacities include personnel, databases, and resources for mobilizing and managing donors, and a lot of marketing and communication and so on and so forth. Now, if you look at institutions that have a long history of fundraising, they have fairly, it requires fairly sophisticated systems, including, of course, huge investments in that enterprise, typically sometimes costing up to a quarter of what you generate in fundraising being investment in the capacities for fundraising. Fundraising professionals are sorely lacking in many African universities, and many of them do not currently have the necessary software and subscriptions to fundraising databases and operations. One of the biggest challenges in many African countries or universities is the lack of a clear understanding by the leadership from boards of trustees, university councils, vice chancellors, and so on, and of course internal leadership, what it really requires to develop robust fundraising processes and operations. The other challenge is, of course, the cultural context. Now, you find that in many African cultures, giving is well developed, but giving is well developed towards people who you are related to. Outside relationships, personal relationships, giving tends to go to the religious organizations. And of course, two dominant religious traditions across Africa, Islam and Christianity, have very robust expectations of giving. But giving to higher education institutions is grossly underdeveloped. Giving to primary and secondary education is fairly well developed. And the reason is that it's because higher education was for a very long time a public enterprise. So people don't understand why they should give to universities. They understand giving to primary schools and to give to secondary schools. But the landscape for philanthropy is beginning to change. There is, of course, different types of philanthropy. There is what some people call horizontal philanthropy, peer-to-peer, usually among poor people who tend to be very generous with each other to support each other through crisis. But there is also vertical philanthropy in which the rich give to the poor, and in this case, you hope the rich give to higher education institutions. And then, of course, there are various intermediary forms of philanthropy. And you also have, of course, the emergence of foundations, the oldest being, in places like the United States and so on. And many of these are spreading to the continent, both in terms of those Western foundations playing a role in Africa, but also indigenous foundations established by rich families, entrepreneurs, and the wealthy establishing foundations. The enabling conditions for philanthropy are growing on the continent despite the enormous challenges. At the policy level, African governments increasingly recognize the important role philanthropy can play in fostering development. Consequently, they are passing enabling legislation. Various studies show this legislation is growing. In Kenya, for example, if you give philanthropic donations, you can deduct it from your taxes. However, trying to get it deducted takes you through a lot of loops. So it's not as easy as the law might imply. The other enabling condition is the rise of high net worth individuals. In fact, the explosion of high net worth individuals on the continent. In 2018, the number of high net worth individuals across Africa, that is people with assets of more than $1 million, was 169,000, with a collective wealth of $1.7 trillion. And Africa is said to, moving forward, will have the fastest rate of growth in terms of high net worth individuals. Now, a lot of these high net worth individuals do not contribute to philanthropy, but some are beginning to do so and establish foundations. Dangote, for example, the richest African, has the Dangote Foundation, which is branching out into various forms of philanthropy. Much of their philanthropy goes into service delivery, health, education, and skills training, housing, food security, access to basic needs. Poverty reduction is another area. Infrastructure support is another area. Culture, particularly the arts. Education is at the very bottom of their philanthropic endeavors. Finally, let me just mention about the growth of private-public partnerships. As financial and other pressures increase on African universities and universities elsewhere, they seek to focus more of their time and resources on their core academic functions of teaching and learning and generating research and scholarship. And they're beginning to outsource a lot of their other functions, including, of course, maintenance of facilities and services, student housing, food services, and beginning to monetize other services like parking and the energy and so on. And as part of this endeavor, you are beginning to see the growth in partnerships with the private sector and other sectors in the provision of services to the universities, including, of course, skills training, student mentoring, and career counseling. In developing these PPPs, it is important, of course, for the investors to be very clear about what they're getting into, because some of them have got burnt. I know a case on a university council that I serve that shall remain nameless, in which they signed a PPP arrangement with an American financier, only to find that there were a lot of hidden clauses which virtually entailed that university to pay almost 10 times as much as they borrowed. So it is important for universities not to rush into some of these things, or if they get engaged in these things, to be very clear as to what they are getting into and make sure that they get the best deal for their institution and not mortgage their institution to some loan sharks who are looking for a pound of flesh from broke universities. Thank you. Now we'll open up the discussion for questions, comments. We've heard a lot of interesting points that have been made by the three presenters. I'll not try to summarize so that we have more time to discuss the issues. What I'd like to perhaps to guide the discussion is a series of questions. I have 4 questions. You don't have to answer them in any particular sequence. Whichever question touches you, and of course you can have your own questions. The first one is, what is the state of financing of higher education in your respective location? Secondly, how can financing of higher education be made more sustainable? And thirdly, how are the alternative models of financing of higher education, whether we are talking about online education or we are talking about philanthropy, how sustainable are these models? And then Roberto's question, which I thought was very, very important, is what kind of institutions of higher education do we want to create as a result of the financing models that seem to be available as the crisis of financing through odd models rears its head? We have about 30 minutes or 25 minutes, something like that. All right? Mm-hmm. Yes. Can somebody pass the mic around?
Okay, in Venezuela, after the economic crisis, public universities have almost no funding. Average salary of a professor is about $50 a month. Universities' infrastructure is in very bad shape due to lack of maintenance. And the universities are really trying to find a way to finance themselves in order to survive this crisis. There's lots of donations from alumni, which are spread now all over the world. But we really are trying hard to get financing. Through services staff can provide, faculty can provide to the society, but not only to the Venezuelan society, because Venezuela does have no money. To outside of Venezuela, to somehow sell doesn't sound nice, but to sell the capacities and the knowledge, and also to network.
She can just pass the mic to the next person. Who wants to make a contribution or ask questions? Either way. Yes.
Thank you very much. I have, is it on?
Yes.
Yeah. I have a question and a comment. And you are raising the financial worries and the consequences that you can pay faculties. I would raise another thing, and that is, if we want to keep high quality of higher educations and we cannot have permanent positions for the faculties, I won't see that we are recruiting the best people for the future. They might go to other works. My question is actually, how do you connect the learning and teaching perspectives in the online courses at the UC?
Well, as I said in my explanation, we are acting as, I can say, as a hub of knowledge, in the way that when we design a program, our full-time professor is designing the curricula of the program, But at the same time, when we are working together with other organizations, we are putting in this development of the program professors of other universities. It could be also full-time professors of other universities. So the idea is to design a program together with other organizations. As the example I put of UNITAR, UNITAR is the United Nations Training and Research Unit, and we are dealing with this master, and we are preparing the design of the master together with the professors of UNITAR. So I think the way of making, when I said we can make this more efficient, is saying, I'm not talking about using part-time professors. What I'm saying is we have to put together the knowledge coming from other organizations and try to define together using technology, and online is the way, and design together programs and research initiatives also. We can also use technology to make research together. But at the end, the idea is trying to design and to define teaching programs with other organizations, with other universities, and put this knowledge together in order to deliver with more insight in our offer. This is the way. Mm-hmm.
Well, now taking advantage that our professor has just mentioned the case of Venezuela, I would like to include for something similar, but for different reasons perhaps, to mention the case of Brazil. In Venezuela, we are supposed to have a left-wing government which favors, social policies and so on and so forth. They have wiped out not only the public universities, even the private universities are in extremely bad shape. In Brazil, an extremely right-wing government is trying to do exactly the same. They are trying to put in place a program. I don't know whether there is a Brazilian here in the audience. They are trying to put in place a policy they call Futuro C, which means privatizing the 64 federal universities in that country. In Brazil, the access to universities is very low. In terms of for the students that low-income students have the opportunity to go to university, and those 64 universities, federal universities, were looking after that sort of population. So that's something that we really need to take into account. Professor Henning Jensen, who is here accompanying us, mentioned in one of the meetings that we held in Mexico a few months ago about the autonomy, that all these events that are happening, at least in Latin America, almost everywhere, the cuts in finance in higher education, particularly the public universities. It's happening in Venezuela, it's happening in Brazil, it's happening in Colombia, it's happening in Ecuador, it's happening in Costa Rica, it's happening in Guatemala. Has a reason. And if not, we have to ask what is the reason that public universities are trying to be wiped out as they are. Well, Professor De La Fuente mentioned yesterday that universities, and particularly public universities, produce a lot of information, very valuable information, which is not in the market. And if governments manage, to put that information in the market, that is worth a lot of money. It's really extreme amount of wealth, which is very valuable. So I agree with Professor Jensen that what is behind, these policies is to put in the market and therefore in private hands all this knowledge that is created by universities. The other things, that have been mentioned, which are also important, of course, the Brazilian government is not interested in teaching philosophers. The Ministry of Education is cynical. I finish. Well, here is a Brazilian fellow, who can speak about Future Se, the Brazilian Minister of Education have said, philosophers, what for? Sociologists, what for? They don't create wealth, And the impact of the cuts of these policies that have been put in place in Brazil, even for the federal, for the state universities, which are the most important one. Here there is the University of the Paulista University. There somewhere is the rector of the Campinas University and the Sao Paulo. The 4 Sao Paulo universities produce, if I am not wrong, 80% of or something of the sort, a very high percentage of research in that country. The cuts that have been put in place are affecting a lot. So I just leave those ideas.
Can we have 2 last comments? Okay, 3. Yeah, but we'll start with the 2 of you there.
Okay, I would just like to comment that government has tried to swipe out universities in Venezuela, but universities, especially traditional public universities, are very strong institutions, and we are trying to keep alive. We're keeping alive. That's why I'm here. Okay? And the other reason, I don't think government wants to somehow get to the knowledge the university produces in Venezuela. It wants to dominate the universities because the universities are critical to the government. So that's a very different issue. That's why they're trying to cut power the universities might have.
All right, I'm Desi Tipan. I'm from the Philippines, and I'd like to take up the discussion about online education. Thing is, our school, De La Salipa in the Philippines, already has 10,000 students, but we'd like to become a resource to the community that is around us, and I think a way to go is online education. Well, everybody in the Philippines almost has a cell phone, and to bring that information into the phone would be able to give access and agility to even to the public school students that are there. The question that is in my mind, however, and it's a challenge that is also happening in our school, is how to onboard our teachers who are, well, not tech savvy, but this is probably something that we can work with UOC moving forward, so that we can also bring them there and make our teachers curators of that knowledge rather than the source of that knowledge.
Yes, I really agree with you. It's very, very difficult, I can say so, because we have the advantage that we grow online at the beginning. It was easy to establish an online university. When you have to start with a face-to-face university, the first step is to convince and to commit the teachers they are inside. So this is the main topic always with face-to-face universities. In fact, in Spain we have a lot of experience that fail because teachers were not involved or were not buying the idea of making online. So how to manage this, in my opinion, is to convince and to coming from the top, from the rector of the university, a clear commitment that online is really a way to spread knowledge outside and to make the university more efficient, not only in terms of economy, but also in terms of knowledge, because, as I said before, online allows to put knowledge coming from outside inside the university. And this is, I think, the only way. So coming as a top-down strategy and involving teachers from the beginning And of course, as I said, what we're doing now as Open University of Catalonia is trying to explain our experience to other universities. We are open to do this, of course, and we can explain how to manage this kind of projects. But nevertheless, I have to admit that changing the mind of teachers is a hard issue, and is the biggest issue you can face in order to transform the university. I agree.
The last comment.
I would just like to comment the last, and that was the issues of that the private funding and private institutions, they don't see more than the STEM. You have not humanity and social sciences. I also would like to raise, we should not discuss that, but I talked to Roberto recently, and that is, in most countries, we have education of school teachers within the higher education institutions. And if we don't have education of school teachers anymore, we will affect the whole educational system.
Please join me in thanking the presenters. We could go on talking about these issues because they're very central to what we do as universities. We need financing. And from what we have heard, the financing of higher education is shifting. There are a lot of challenges. In fact, in some cases, there is a crisis of financing for higher education, which has implications for the quality of higher education. However, a lot of higher education institutions are looking for alternative funding or diversifying their revenue streams. And one of those promising areas is, of course, the provision of online education. And we heard, what is happening in that space in the case of UOC in Spain. And then, of course, the whole issue of, what this implies for the sustainability of our institutions in terms of quality. One sad development is that in many countries, certainly in many African countries, the higher education sector is no longer attracting the best and the brightest to become teachers, to become lecturers, to become instructors, because there are better ways of making a living. In many of these countries, it's no longer a question of publish or perish, it's teach or perish, meaning that a lot of people are now doing multiple jobs as adjuncts in order to make a living, which of course leaves very little room for research, which is fundamental to trying to address the pressing national, regional, and global challenges. So we have a lot of work cut out for ourselves in this sector, but obviously we have to keep striving to make sure that the sector continues to survive, because fundamentally the world, humanity, needs highly educated people to find solutions to some of the problems that we have and to make systemic contributions to society. So thank you, and good luck to all of us as we try to do this.